All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Mike Mimoso, the editorial director here at Claroty, and joining me shortly will be our Chief Strategy Officer, Grant Geyer. We are going to spend a few minutes today talking about a new Team 82 report that was published this week. The report looks at the riskiest operational technology exposures that put organizations in the crosshairs of adversaries. We analyzed close to 1 million OT devices within 270 organizations. Those companies are primarily within the manufacturing industry, as well as natural resources companies and those operating in logistics and transportation. These sectors are, of course, among the most pivotal to our way of life, as well as national and economic security. So this was a pretty important exercise to us, and we are absolutely excited to talk about it today. So of course, you can download and read the full paper at claroty.com and see all the results for yourself. But Grant and I are going to discuss them today briefly and introduce you to the paper. So let's kick this off and bring in Grant. It's good to see you. How you doing?
Good, Mike. How are you?
Good, thanks. Good, thanks. Always enjoy doing these with you, Grant. So I suppose we should start off by explaining a couple of things before we just dig into the data a little bit. Just, from your perspective, what do we mean when we're talking about exposures? And then two, how can adversaries, how are they leveraging these exposures? Are we talking about advanced attackers or script kiddies or all of the above? What's your take there?
Yeah, so much attention goes in terms of vulnerability research and in terms of how asset owners and operators and IT teams think about security in terms of reducing your attack surface area through a vulnerability management program. But when you look at the National Vulnerability Database, there's over 250,000 unique vulnerabilities in the catalog, which is an overwhelming amount. And when it comes down, and about I think around 10% of those are rated as critical, and so it's like an overwhelming number of vulnerabilities to tackle. I will talk more about that in a second with KEVs. But in addition to that, like so much attention is paid there, but I think, and Claroty thinks that not enough attention is being paid to what we term exposures. These are things like default passwords, hard-coded credentials, clear text communications, things that attackers could exploit without the need for a sophisticated method of exploiting a vulnerability. And so these are just as prolific, if not more so, and just as potentially harmful to cyber risk within organizations. So we're trying to broaden the aperture so that we can think about these additional class of exposures that assets may have.
And how about the adversary question? Just what are these guys doing to leverage these exposures?
So I'll just say succinctly, we think about this from a nation state perspective and their proxies. And the term I like to use is the cranks, and that stands for China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And they each have specific desires. Some of them, such as Russia, give safe harbor to ransomers the ransomers are working to run a nefarious business, but at the same time they're given safe harbor so that Russia can direct their resources when necessary. Russia is also looks to use OT assets as a means of causing disruption in the physical world. We've seen the attacks against the Ukrainian power grid that happened, I think, in 2020 and 2021 that were used to deny services. We've more recently seen China and Russia infiltrate water treatment systems within the United States as a means of both projecting power as well as demonstrating or trying to harm the public's confidence in the government's ability to keep them safe.
So let's talk about KEVs, because you brought them up a second ago. They're known exploited vulnerabilities, obviously. And in the report, we spend a lot of time talking about KEVs. And, when you combine that with insecure connectivity, for example, directly connecting OT to the internet, you really kind of reduce the number of vulnerable devices that you need to. It helps you prioritize what you remediate, what you mitigate first, right? I think that's a kind of an important distinction in the report as well.
Yeah, and in this context, what we mean by exposure management, instead of thinking about vulnerability management and trying to patch across all those 250,000 vulnerabilities, CISA has produced what's known as the KEV catalog, known exploited vulnerabilities, which essentially says, don't focus on 250,000, focus on the ones that there's a known exploit or known ransomware in the wild that can actually affect a breach today. And so that enables us to reduce the aperture in terms of what you need to do. And what we found, as you said, is about 12% of the devices had a KEV, which is not surprising considering many HMIs and engineering workstations are run on Windows, and 25% of the KEV catalog is known exploits on Windows. When we kind of broke that down and say, okay, of that 12%, what percent are tied to ransomware? It's about 7.2% of the devices. And if you take it another step, which ones have insecure connectivity and are also can be exploited by ransomware? So which of these assets are directly connected to the internet? It's only 0.4%. And that may sound like a low number, but that 0.4% of those million assets are distributed across 31% of the 270 organizations we analyzed, meaning roughly 80, 90 of the organizations in our survey have a means for an attacker to get in and disrupt the process, whether the process is a manufacturing process, some form of natural resource exploration or distribution, or power transmission or water treatment. So that's, I think, kind of a scary set of numbers. Even though the number is small, the potential impact is enormous.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the ransomware link and the KEVs that are being leveraged by these gangs. While these aren't necessarily attacks directly against OT devices, I mean, we've seen high-profile attacks already where, production is impacted and processes are impacted. So, I mean, what do we need to know about ransomware today in 2025 in the first couple of months?
Well, what I'd say, first of all, is that it's a thriving business for the attackers. Second is that a lot of the attacks tend to be Windows based. They tend to be focused around these KEVs. And I gave you the bad news story before that it's spread across 31% of the organizations in our study. The good news story here, when you look at it through the lens of I don't have to do everything, I need to focus on what matters most. It's not as much effort for those 90 organizations to patch the 0.4% of the devices. So I think the level of effort to make them ransomware safe is much smaller, and the potential reduction of risk is enormous because those are the entry points into the organization.
Mm-hmm. So before we wrap up, I want to talk about manufacturing, which was our most statistically significant part of the data set. Some pretty big critical infrastructure companies in that sector, automotive companies, food and beverage, many others. I'm sure there are a lot of leaders in terms of tech adoption there, but we had some pretty high numbers around KEVs linked to ransomware in manufacturing, and a high percentage of organization with KEVs linked to ransomware and insecurely connected to the internet. What do those numbers tell you about what's happening in those industries?
It's a really interesting question that, industrial security is so focused on the vertical business in which they operate. Manufacturing, because of the need to leverage technology, the public cloud, faster cycle times of production, there's more need to connect, from OT into IT and up to the public cloud. And that creates a situation where that obsolescent or vulnerable and exposed tech is potentially exploitable, right? So what we saw is 13%, well, there's 13% of the devices had KEVs, which is the same as the global number. 74% of the organizations, that accounted for 74% of the organizations in the study. And it turned out that like 9.1% had linked to ransomware. So the numbers are higher. And when you look at those numbers compared to the numbers within logistics and transportation and natural gas tend to be more on-prem. They tend to be more layered levels of protection. And so the numbers were actually significantly smaller in logistics and transportation and natural resources. So I think the message here is, in order to enable manufacturing organizations, in order for manufacturing organizations to accomplish their digital transformation goals and connect up to the cloud, they can do that, but it's all about doing it responsibly by securing user to machine, machine to machine, and cloud workload to machine communications. That's how you can enable the business to accomplish its top line, bottom line outcomes, but do so in a way that mitigates potential risk of an exposure or the risk that an attacker could get into the environment.
Yep. All right, Grant, great stuff. Before we wrap up, just want to give you a chance to make either a final comment or provide a couple of recommendations to the listeners.
Look, I think the most important thing is don't get overwhelmed by every vulnerability. Focus down the scope of your program to the exposures that matter most, which are the KEVs, things like default passwords, and those that are insecurely connected to the internet. You do that, you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of remediation efforts.
Excellent. All right, Grant, good to see you again. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Just a reminder to download the report at Claroty.com. Have a great day.
Take care, Mike.
Bye-bye.